Well, we got a whole busload coming in. That's good. Come right on in. Thank you, Keith. David, good to hear you pray this morning. Good to see you folks today. Linda and I are really thrilled to be with you this week. I want to alleviate any fear you might have that because Linda's picture appeared with mine that she intends to do some preaching. She assured me she will not say a word. She will not have anything to say in our assemblies. And I think that's the first time in all of these years a church has put my picture in with my wife's picture that we're holding a gospel meeting. So there's no telling what kind of rumors have spread about John and Linda Cannon. Anyway, that's good. Nancy, good to see you. David Ballard and I are good friends and have been a long time. And today he's preaching in Broken Bow and I'm preaching here. Church in Broken Bow supports his work in Cameroon. And it's been at least 2, maybe 3 years since he's had a chance to go up there and report on his work. And I know he's had an opportunity to be in Cameroon this year in the last few weeks, few months. So I know they're excited to hear about that work. Now, the reason David hadn't been able to go up there is because before I started preaching in Broken Bow, David called me his associate minister. And anytime he needed to go someplace, I was available, would come out here and preach some. Keith, I know, has done that as well. So that changed the last few years. I just started my 4th year of preaching at Broken Bow. I never thought I would ever tell a church, I'm starting my 2nd year with you, much less 3rd and now 4th. Retired in 2017 officially. Good morning. And I will tell you this, the Lord is good. Linda sometimes thinks he's too good because she said, I thought you were going to slow down. Well, I haven't slowed down. I've speeded up. And there haven't been many Sundays since 2017 that I haven't been standing in a pulpit somewhere preaching the Word. And I want you to know, I love this church. I love all of our congregations. But I especially have a place in my heart for our smaller congregations. I look at your attendance board. I see 27 last Sunday. I see 18 one Sunday. We count because everyone counts. Now, there's an attendance board just like that one in a little church building south of or north of Prescott, Arkansas. The little church was called Pleasant Hill. The attendance board in that church building today reads last Sunday 6. And that was their last Sunday. That was sometime in the 1970s, so that's been a long time, but that's where I started preaching. For a church about this size, every other Sunday I preached at Pleasant Hill and Hickory Grove. Those were 2 rural churches just a few miles outside of Prescott, Arkansas. Starting in 1964, I was of the prime age of 16. I called it preaching. Most of the people that came out said, good talk. And I was happy to find out that I had made a good talk. I thought I had preached a magnificent sermon, but I found out I'd just given a good talk. And Cleon Lyles told me years ago, he said, John, he said, regardless of how old you might get, if you have people come by and say, that was a good talk, preacher, he said, take it as a compliment, because it's a lot better to hear that as they walk past the door than to hear someone say, that old boy could really preach. So I'll take good talk anytime. Glad to have Cleve and Sharon Finley here today. Our paths go back a long ways. 1977, if I'm not mistaken. You know, the problem with coming back to town after you've been gone a long time is everybody's gotten older. and including myself. Now, Linda hasn't gotten much older, just a little bit. But the other dilemma you're faced with is you come back to where you've been, and some of those older people are dying. And folks are saying, John, I'm counting on you to preach my funeral. And I told this not long ago at a service. I said, well, there's one little statement I have to make in regard to that, and it's this: if I'm still around. And so that's true. It's been a while since I've been out here, and I was going to say a little bit more about our rural congregations, our small town congregations. As I just mentioned, the one where I began preaching in 1964 hasn't existed now as a church, just a building. I've taken my grandkids by there a time or two and showed them where I started preaching, and then I said, now, in a minute after we look at this little building through the windows the building's locked up now. It's about the size of this church building right here. I guess the only time the doors are unlocked is when they have a funeral, because the cemetery is next door. And I've told my grandkids that once we see the building, I'll take you out in the cemetery and I'll introduce you to all the people who were members of this church, because that's where they are now. So our rural churches, smaller congregations, are having a hard time. And I guess that's always been the case, that churches have a limited time of life based upon an active membership. Membership gets old, we have more deaths than we do baptisms, our new folks coming into the community, more people moving out of a community, young folks going off to the big cities to make a living, and find a good job and provide for their family, and the next thing you know, we have just a remnant, a handful of folks that are trying to keep so many of our congregations alive. That's you and you and you and you. And the smaller a church gets, the more important it is for every member to be as involved as they possibly can in the life of that church. Now, that's true if a church is a big church or a little church. It doesn't make any difference. God counts every one of us as a member of His body, and we all have gifts pertaining to the faith that we have, and those gifts should be used for the upbuilding of the kingdom. So your place in this church is very important. If your pew is empty, if your place is not filled, if your gift is not being used, then that's a detriment to this congregation. You say, well, if I'm not here, that won't make much difference. What if everybody thought that? What if every member said, well, I can't do much. Matter of fact, I don't know of anything I could do except polish a pew. We don't have to polish them anymore because they're all padded, right? So do your part in the life of this church. More about Jesus. Keith gave me an option for a couple of songs. I said more about Jesus. So that's really our theme these next few days. And by the way, this meeting will be half over this afternoon. Think about that. Preacher thinks about that because I know there are 6 times that I'm going to be standing in this pulpit to preach between now and Wednesday night. 3 of them are today. Half of our effort will be over by this afternoon, sometime around 2:30, 3 o'clock. Depends on how long you let me preach this afternoon. I may be preached out by the time we get to lunch. Anyway, it's going to be a good time. I commit to you that I'll be here. I'll do the best I can through my study and preparation and a few years' experience to have something worthwhile from God's Word. It's going to be more about Jesus. Looking to Jesus is the real theme of these lessons. And we will begin a little later today looking at the book of Hebrews. Specifically, going through some selected text in Hebrews that help us really get a good understanding of who Jesus is, not who Jesus was, but who Jesus is, and what he means to us and what he is doing for us presently. Jesus is not someone who's locked up inside a book covered with black leather. Jesus is alive today. And a key verse in the book of Hebrews that we'll talk about this week is Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 8. And there it says, Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that, in a sense, tells me that Jesus is our contemporary. He is the same yesterday, we might say the time of the Scriptures, the time of the New Testament, the first century. He's the same today as he was then. Yesterday, he's the same today, and he will be the same forever. I'll never forget misquoting that verse, and when I did, I thought, that doesn't sound right. I just changed one word. I said, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Tomorrow is not far enough. Tomorrow doesn't include forever, and he is the same forever. 30 years ago, this past November the 9th, I experienced something that was a life-changing event. It was a tragedy. It was a sad day. It's the day that our church building in Arlington, Texas burned to the ground. Now, that's a tough thing for any congregation, but when you have 1,500 members and your church building burns, folks, you got to work hard to keep that group of people together, especially in the Metroplex. I mean, there are more congregations of Churches of Christ in Dallas, Fort Worth, and Arlington, and the surrounding Metroplex area than there is anywhere in the United States except maybe Florence, Alabama, per capita, maybe Nashville, Tennessee. So, we were a church without walls. And I was a preacher that didn't even have a Bible, except maybe a Bible or two I had at the church. The only thing that survived in my office, my study, was the cover title page of my preaching Bible. That's it. 3 days after the fire, I'm on the scene. I'm standing in rubber boots that are hot because the soles are melting from the heat and the coals underneath the ashes. And I'm digging and scratching, trying to find something left of a 3,000 volume library, study notes, sermons, 25 years of ministry, just like that. I found my title sheet to my Bible, just kind of laying there, sifting in the air. I went over to a spot that I knew if I could find anything at all, it would be packed in the 2 file boxes or file drawers that were in that corner. Everything was at least 2 feet under ash, and so I began digging. And when I got to that spot, I was happy to see that because those 2 file drawers were packed so tightly, they were soaked with water as the firemen attempted to fight the fire, but everything was there. It was just sopping wet. But inside that top file drawer, I was looking for something very special. It was a box that contained some of my early Bibles and New Testaments that I started preaching with, even a couple that belonged to my dad and my mom. Those were precious to me, and I'm happy to tell you that as I dug down, I found that box. And I opened it up, and I could have, if it'd been a sponge, I would have just squeezed all the water out, but I couldn't do it that way. So I found out that if you take things that are soaking wet, you can put a few pages at a time in a microwave, and you can dry them out quicker. There I found, I meant to bring it this morning, but that would just be a visual aid so you can kind of see that it's precious to me. I found my first New Testament. The title page was said to Johnny Cannon on his 10th birthday. Love, Mommy and Daddy. That's the New Testament I first read through, even before I was baptized, 1958. It's the first New Testament that I also gave those talks from. And it is the New Testament that I preached from the Sunday after the fire. 1,200 people gathered at Martin High School in southwest Arlington. And I want to tell you, when you have a church of that size and you have people that come from various places throughout that area of Arlington and Mansfield and Fort Worth and other places around Grand Prairie, you just wonder, what do you say to those folks on the Sunday that they're finding out our church building burned to the ground? That was not a surprise, and it wasn't a secret, because we had been on every major TV station in Dallas-Fort Worth about the fire at the Pleasant Ridge Church of Christ in Arlington. A lot of those people showed up from the various TV stations. You know what they were impressed with? It wasn't the sermon I preached that day. After services, a lot of these men and women who came to report that we had gathered together, number one, they were shocked that many of our people showed up at a school building after our building had burned. Number two, what they were really impressed with was, preacher, this church sang songs today without any books. When do y'all get together to practice? I said, every time the doors are open. They could not believe a cappella singing. They could not believe 1,200 people sang without songbooks. The reason we could do that is because we've sung these songs all of our lives. They're in here. And from in here, they come out of our heart, through our mouth and our lips, by which we praise God. And so that morning, I preached out of that little charcoal New Testament. It still smells like a Whopper burger. But I'm so glad to have it, because it reminded me of my roots. It reminded me of the tradition of faith in my family and in my personal life. And here's the text I preached from that morning. It's John chapter 16, verse 33. John 16 and verse 33. It's a promise that Jesus made to his apostles, and I would say to all who would follow him. John 16:33, he says, "These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation, but take courage. I have overcome the world." The reason I chose that text is because I just wanted to speak a word of encouragement to a group of believers whose church home had just been destroyed by fire. Are we going to survive? Where are we going to meet? How are we going to get through this? How long is it going to take? Well, it took a little over 2.5 years to rebuild. In the course of those 2.5 years, we continued to meet in school buildings. We even leased some other church buildings on different days of the week. Instead of Wednesday night, we met on Thursday nights. We met in schools on Thursdays. We met in homes every Sunday night. Now that's a lot of homes. That's a lot of folks getting together. But we survived. As a matter of fact, we came back stronger. We built a bigger church building, but more importantly, we became a better church in the midst of our trials and tribulations. My sermon that day was entitled, "The Steeple Still Stands." We had a little steeple that never did make it up on the top of the church building when it was first built in 1977. And so they put it over on a little section of the building where the educational building was and over the offices. I guess they felt like the church offices need a steeple present more than any place in the whole church building. We need to know God's there every day. All right. So I'll tell you that story because I don't want you to feel sorry for me, because Linda and I survived this. It was one of the hardest periods of my life. It was one of the most challenging times of our life as minister and Mrs. Minister, to keep a church together, to keep us moving, to keep us growing. We did what we had to do to survive. You would do the same if your home burned, and churches have to do the same when their home burns. It's from this passage we see Jesus saying some things that will help us in time of trouble. Do we live in troubled times? I even caught a little news this morning, and it was not good news. There's more bad news every day when you turn on the TV or even the radio, or if you look on your phone. Apple News sends me something every morning, and I trash it as soon as I see what the headline is, because I don't want to start the day with bad news. And so, yes, we live in troubled times, but if you'll turn back to John chapter 14, John 14, Jesus mentions there in chapter 16, in this world you have tribulation. That's the word for trouble. That's the word for difficulties, for trying circumstances. And Jesus here in John chapters 13 through 17, it's referred to as the Lord's last discourse. These are the chapters in the Gospel of John where John records some of the last teaching Jesus gave specifically to the 12. It's like he took them aside and said, "Now guys, there's some things you need to know before I leave." It's before I leave that had them troubled. They could not imagine what their lives were going to be like without Jesus. And that's why he says, I want to tell you some things you need to know and you need to believe. And there in John 14, verse 1, what does he say to these men? Let not your heart be troubled. You believe in God, believe also in me. The trouble in their heart was stirred up because Jesus has announced to them, I'm going away, and where I go, you cannot go. Now you have to realize that these men had been following Jesus for 9 to 3 years. Everywhere Jesus went, they went. If you saw Jesus, you saw an entourage of about 12 other men and maybe others, and sometimes thousands of people that were following Jesus. But the core were the 12. So we have the training of the 12 in about a 3-year period because of their close proximity to Jesus. Always there, listening to what Jesus said, watching the miracles that he performed, and doing what he asked them to do. And now they hear that he's going away. Let not your heart be troubled. In chapter 16, verse 33, we encountered that little phrase, these things I have spoken to you. And I want you to know that there's at least a half a dozen times in this last discourse, these final teachings, his farewell teachings that Jesus gives to the apostles. There's 6 times, I think, where Jesus will say, this is why I'm telling you this. These things I have spoken to you. Follow with me. We're in chapter 14, verse 1, but drop down to chapter 14 and verse 25. And this is the first time Jesus makes this statement. These things I have spoken to you while abiding with you, while I am still here. And that word abide often is translated to dwell among. Jesus says, I'm in your midst now, and while I'm here, I want to say some things to you. Now that was significant because they were already thinking, what are we going to do when he's gone? Who's going to tell us what we need to do? Who's going to reveal to us the will of God? Jesus said, while I'm here, I want to say some things to you. And then you'll notice in chapter 15 and verse 11, he says it again. These things I have spoken to you, that my joy may be in you, and that your joy may be made full. It's kind of a paradox, I think, that to troubled hearts, Jesus talks to them about joy. I mean, when things aren't going the way you want them to go, is that a happy time? You know, you've seen these little signs, this is my happy place. Maybe it's the lake, maybe it's a cabin, maybe it's a special place off in the woods somewhere, maybe it's a park bench down in the park. This is my happy place. Well, this was not their happy place. They were upset. And Jesus said, but listen, I'm speaking these things to you that my joy might be in you, and that your joy may be made full. So we often think of joy or happiness or a state of blessedness, if you want to put some scripture thought to it, is always dependent upon everything being right, circumstances going the way I want them to go. Have you noticed that that usually doesn't happen? That there are circumstances in life over which we have no control, and we get up thinking this is going to be a good day, and then one of those circumstances shows up and we think, oh my gracious, I wasn't prepared for this today, but thank you, Lord, I'm going to be happy and joyful. No, we usually kind of mope around a little bit. We have to have an attitude adjustment. And Jesus is talking to these men under those circumstances. I've spoken these things to you that my joy might be in you, and that your joy may be made full, complete, mature. All right? That's not the last time. Turn to chapter 16 and verse 1. These things I have spoken to you, that you may be kept from stumbling. Jesus said, I don't want you to give up. I don't want you to be knocked down. I don't want you to feel like you can't go on any longer and be faithful followers of me. And so I'm going to tell you some things that will help you to be strong. Look at verse 4, 16 verse 4. But these things I have spoken to you, that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told you of them. Now Jesus is going to make reference to the hour in the Gospel of John, and he will sometimes say, but my hour has not yet come. And here he says that when their hour comes, you will remember, I told you so. I told you this. This is the way it's going to unfold. This is what's going to happen. This is how you're going to feel. This is what's going to happen to me. The hour that Jesus has reference to is his death. It's not just a 1 hour event. As a matter of fact, John chapters 18 through 21 describe that hour, but it's a whole week leading up to his death on the cross. So he's getting them ready for a tough time that's coming up. And some of them, well, all of them are going to be present to some extent. Some of them are going to have a hard time with this. The Apostle Peter, for example, is going to deny the Lord 3 times during this hour that Jesus is going to experience the last week of his life. We often refer to it as the Passion. Now, let's see what else he says in chapter 16 and verse 25. he says, these things I have spoken to you in figurative language or in proverbs. An hour is coming when I will speak no more to you in figurative language, but will tell you plainly of the Father. So there's that hour again. There's that tough time that's approaching. And in the meantime, Jesus says, I'm going to have to speak in such a way that you'll get what I'm trying to tell you. Symbolic language, figurative language, proverbs. But he said, the time's coming. I'm going to tell you plainly what it's all about. There are things that happen to us in life that we're kind of glad we had a chance to get ready for. You know what I'm saying? But a lot of the hard times, we don't have time to get ready for them. April the 2nd, 1982, Paris tornado. I remember the date for that one, and I think I can remember the date for this last one was about November the 4th, this past fall. And we had a little more chance to get ready for some of that. But there are times that things like a Texas tornado come upon us and someone says, you better get ready. Oh, well, you know, it's not going to hit our house. We're not going to have any problem. Our house has been standing here for 75 years, and this farm's been here for a century, and it's like the old farmer, every time the wind blew, his wife said, we got to go to the cellar, honey. I mean, and it was always in the middle of the night, you know. No, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to ride it out. Well, you better go because it's out there in the pasture right now. You see those cows in the air? It's going to be bad. I'm going to ride it out. Well, finally, they said, we're dragging you out the cellar. They got him out there. And they shut the door, pulled it down, and held on to it to keep it from blowing away. Sun came up the next morning. The old farmer got up. He cracked the door, and he looked out there, and the barn was gone. Cattle strode out across the pasture. No sign of a house. All the trees were just laying over, stripped of their leaves. And he looked out there, and he said, well, that's more like it. If I'm going to go to the cellar, I want something bad to happen. Well, that was more like it. Well, sometimes we find the conclusion is, that's more like it. That's bad. But getting ready for something to be bad and knowing ahead of time to be prepared for it, that's what Jesus is doing with these men. I'm telling you these things now so that when the hour comes, you will remember. He told us. He explained this to us. And so that last one is chapter 16, verse 33. That's the one we started with. These things I have spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you have tribulation. Take courage. I have overcome the world. Here's what I told a church 30 years ago from this text. I tell it to you today because it's still what Jesus said. Jesus said, in the world you have tribulation. Now, these men were getting a taste of that. But it was going to get tough, and it was going to get tougher. And when Jesus died and was resurrected and ascended, they had it. They had to be reminded, oh yes, we're to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Every person needs to hear about Jesus. In the world, you have tribulation. I'm looking into faces this morning, and I would venture to say every one of us have had some experience with tough times. The reason I'm preaching at Broken Bow is because of COVID-19. That's it. And because of COVID-19, God in His timetable found a church that needed a preacher, and the church found a preacher that needed a church. I'll tell you, a preacher without a church is a bad situation. And so when I got that call on a Saturday night, John, we understand you might be available to preach some for us up here at Broken Bow. Our preacher has just moved. We need some help. I said, I can. When would you like for me to be there? In the morning. That's the kind of warnings you get when you're an interim preacher. You know, you just, by the way, you got one you can pull out for in the morning. I said, yes. Well, anyway, long story short, 6 months later, they announced, we have decided to put up with John for a little while longer. I kid you not, that's an exact quote of how I was introduced as the minister at the Broken Bow Church of Christ. One of the best introductions I've ever had, because it had been a trial there for a few months. They were still looking for a preacher, and then they came and said, we're not looking for a preacher anymore, John, because we believe it's a God thing that we got together. And I said, I agree. So we're going to put up with you a little while longer. Well, what does Jesus say about troubled times? He says, I'm telling you these things so that you might have peace, even in the midst of tribulation. Now, this isn't the first time he's offered them peace. Turn back about a page to chapter 14 and look at verse 27. He says, peace I leave with you. My peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful. What does the world offer? The world offers trouble. The world offers difficulty, uncontrollable circumstances. What does Jesus offer instead of that? I give you peace. Now, it's not the kind of peace the world gives. We talk about peace when it's the absence of conflict, when there are no wars. There are people in the Ukraine, our brothers and sisters in Christ, and I cannot imagine what they've been going through. And some of them have fled for their lives, and in some instances, they're still worshiping underground. And in the midst of a world that has exploded right in their neighborhood, they have peace that Jesus offers. They're praying today. They're reading the Word today. They're remembering the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ today. In the world, all they have to do is look outside. There's tribulation everywhere. What's happening in here? The peace that passes understanding. The tranquility of the spirit and the soul, that's what Jesus offers. And then he says, not only that, but I want you to know that in a time when you might be fearful, and we just read that in John 14, let not your heart be troubled, nor let it be fearful. When things are out of control and you realize you're not in control, that causes fear to build up in our lives. I would be less than honest if I didn't tell you that those first few weeks of the COVID pandemic, I was just as fearful as you were. And then one day a doctor told me, John, I'm sorry to tell you, but you have tested positive for COVID. And then a year later, the doctor told me the same thing. But the first time I heard that, I wouldn't have been more shocked if he had said, you have 4th stage cancer. I mean, the C word, the COVID, was spelled D-E-A-T-H. People were dying like flies everywhere. And my heart was filled with fear. Jesus says, don't be troubled nor fearful, because I want you to take courage. The King James says, be of good cheer. Now, I haven't really checked out those words, but to me, they're not exactly the same. How can you be of good cheer if you're fearful? How can you be of good cheer and courageous at the same time? It's all a matter of outlook. But this is what Jesus and what God has told so many people that were believers down through the centuries. I've read it in the Bible too many times. There's over 300 times that God says, do not be afraid. And Jesus had encountered many things with these 12, and he knew they were scaredy cats. He'd been out on the Sea of Galilee with them. Oh, ye of little faith. Why are you afraid? Why are you fearful? And what did he offer that day? Well, he even offered to the Sea of Galilee, peace, be still. And in our own lives, we need to accept that peace. And sometimes it can only come in moments of solitude when we slow down and get still enough to know that God is God and I am not. So Jesus not only offers peace in the midst of pain and tribulation and trouble, but he offers courage in the place of fear. That's the first thing and maybe the last thing that God said to Joshua. Can you imagine a young man taking over the leadership of an aged Moses? Moses, man, I'm not talking about some minor prophet. I'm talking about Moses. If you look at the Bible, there are two primary characters. I would add three with Paul, but I would say Moses, Jesus, and Paul. And Joshua, if you will please come forward, Joshua, and take the reins of leadership from Moses and lead these people into the promised land. And you know what God says? Be very strong and courageous. Jesus offers us that courage of spirit and heart to deal with the tough times in life. And then he says, and here's a great statement that Jesus makes. He says, because I have overcome the world. Jesus offers us victory in place of defeat. When we think the tribulation is more than we can handle, when we think our heart is so filled with fear we can't go forward in faith, Jesus reminds us we are on the winning side. Really? Church, look around this morning. You could feel so defeated. And I'm not trying to be negative here. I'm a realist. But you could feel so defeated as a church that there are more empty pews than there are filled pews. Now, I expect some more of these pews to fill because in my life in the churches of Christ, I've found out most churches where I preach, they're the largest non-Sunday school church in town. Oh no, we believe in Sunday school. We believe in having Bible classes. Do the numbers prove that we really believe that? Just an aside. And so we could get the idea that we're having a hard time. We're struggling keeping this church alive. I don't know if we're going to make it. Jesus said, take courage. I have overcome the world. Do you know the word that's used in the book of Revelation more than any other to describe God's people? Overcomers. Conquerors. Now I'm going to pull a little Greek on you. I won't do that very often because I can't pull very much Greek on you, okay? But I would venture to say that there's someone sitting here right now that wears a garment or perhaps a pair of shoes that has a little check mark on it, which indicates the product is called Nike. Nike is the Greek word found in Revelation. Overcomers. Conquerors. That's the word God describes, even at the end of the Bible, to a generation of first century Christians who wondered, Are we going to make it? Jesus says, you take courage because I have overcome the world. So these are my thoughts this morning out of this little one verse that has meant so much to me all my life, but especially at a real trying time in my life and the life of the church that felt like they might not be able to survive. If you ever have that feeling, life's tough, I'm going down, my faith is failing, I'm more fearful than I am faithful, I can't have a good attitude about life, accept these promises of Jesus in John 16 and verse 33. If you have not marked one thing in the Gospel of John, I ask you to draw a circle around John 16 and verse 33, and you will find yourself coming back to it from time to time. You may not actually be looking for it, but the next time you read through John, you'll say, now why have I got 1633 circled? It'll come back to you. And you might even ask yourself, how am I doing in reference to these promises? Has this made a difference in my life? Jesus in troubled times. We're going to find out in the book of Hebrews, Jesus knows just what I need, and he's there to help us under all circumstances. That'll be the end of our class this morning. We'll get cranked up here in just a little bit for our time of worship.